And now for Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the rest, Marine Corps.
In mid-1944, U.S. forces seized the Marianas. But where to strike next? Should the Philippine Islands be invaded? Or, as the Navy advocated, should the next move be to Formosa and then the China coast? In Honolulu in mid-July 1944, Admiral Chester Nimitz summed up the advantages of the Formosa plan for an interested listener who expressed enthusiasm for the idea and seemed definitely opposed to General MacArthur's proposed Philippine operation. But as the conference continued, the general argued so convincingly for permission to make good his promise to return to the Philippines that the president finally endorsed his plan. U.S. forces in the Western Pacific had progressed by September 44 to Morotai and Palau. 1 month later, a strong invasion armada moved toward the island of Leyte in the vulnerable central Philippines. The carriers continued their attacks against enemy targets throughout the Philippines. Hit a great variety of targets. In mid-October, the invasion fleet began the last leg of the trip to the objective. The mighty armada included combat and assault vessels of all types, escorted by 6 battleships. Aboard the cruiser Nashville, General MacArthur was confident of the success of his mission as he surveyed the powerful fleet. This impressive convoy was transporting some 170,000 American soldiers to the invasion beaches on Leyte. GIs from Oregon and Ohio, Mississippi and Montana, all intent on paying the Japanese back for Bataan and Corregidor. On the morning of October 20th, the invasion fleet stood off Leyte, and the assault troops moved toward shore near Tacloban. The first wave was scheduled to hit the beach at 10 o'clock. The assault on Leyte carried the fighting forces of the Southwest Pacific some 2,500 miles from the point on New Guinea where the offensive against the enemy in that theater had begun. Right on schedule, the assault troops landed. Soldiers of the 10th Corps of the U.S. 6th Army. The landing near Tacloban went off smoothly, and U.S. forces quickly set about securing a position of sufficient area to facilitate a successful defense. On the Nashville, General MacArthur and Philippine President Sergio Osmeña prepared to go ashore several hours after the first waves landed. Osmeña was returning to his native land after an absence of some 2.5 years. The general set foot on Philippine soil for the first time since his departure from Corregidor in March 1942. About 20 miles to the south at Dulag, GIs of the 24th Corps made a second landing, coordinated with the invasion near Tacloban. By the end of D-Day, the beaches were secure, and the area was given a careful going over for enemy mines. While the beachhead was being cleared, the 96th Division advanced along the flank. At Dulag, too, the invasion was a complete success. But the U.S. advantage was not to go unchallenged. 2 American submarines, the Darter and the Dace, proceeding through a narrow channel off Palawan in the western Philippines in the early morning of October 23rd, spotted a strong enemy naval force and promptly attacked. Torpedo attacks were made on 3 enemy cruisers. Two of the cruisers were sunk, one damaged. This engagement was the prelude to one of the most memorable battles in naval history. The U.S. Third Fleet lay in wait for a possible attack by enemy naval units in the Philippine Sea, to the east of the central Philippines. The U.S. Seventh Fleet protected the entrance to Leyte Gulf and the beachhead. On October 23rd and 24th, two Japanese naval forces proceeded eastward toward the U.S. position on Leyte. At 9:10 a.m. on the 24th, Halsey's carriers launched their planes in an attack on the enemy's central force. At 10:20, the enemy fleet was spotted entering the Sibuyan Sea. The U.S. planes attacked immediately. Some 250 U.S. planes hit the enemy fleet. Succeeding waves of U.S. planes kept up a continuing attack for 5 hours. At 3:30, the Japanese force turned and withdrew after hits had been scored on several of its warships. Survivors of the super battleship Musashi, sunk by U.S. air action, were picked up by other enemy ships. The enemy's naval strategy called for a decoy force to try to lure Halsey out of position. Halsey bit. He took his Third Fleet north to meet the expected threat, since he thought that the enemy's central force had been routed. But that force had reversed itself again. Seventh Fleet escort carriers were all that stood between the Leyte beachhead and the Japanese central force, which slipped through San Bernardino Strait at midnight. Meanwhile, the main strength of the Seventh Fleet was concentrated on Surigao Strait, as the enemy's southern force approached it from the other side. A division of PT boats, commanded by Lieutenant Weston Pullen, spotted the vanguard of the enemy's southern force.
All during that night, we were under heavy attack from the enemy's warships, but some of our boats managed to get close enough to do some damage.
The battleships of the U.S. 7th Fleet, which were equipped with the latest radar apparatus, waited through the night until the enemy came well within range of their guns. The enemy force was moving right into the trap. Some of the battleships used radar fire control devices. The gunners held their fire until the enemy's lead ship was only 21,000 yards away. In the Battle of Surigao Strait, the enemy's naval force was overwhelmingly defeated. But the Japanese central force knifed down from San Bernardino Strait and attacked U.S. escort carriers and destroyers, sinking 4 ships. Meanwhile, to the north, the powerful U.S. Third Fleet, commanded by Admiral Halsey, was pursuing the enemy's decoy fleet, which the Admiral was convinced constituted the main enemy striking force. On the morning of October 25th, the Third Fleet was hundreds of miles from the battle off Samar. Word of the engagement came through, but Halsey's force continued chasing the enemy's suicide fleet. At 8:10 that morning, Halsey's planes spotted the enemy, and within 10 hours, his task force sank 4 Japanese carriers. The remnants of the decoy force turned and fled. Halsey sped south, but too late. The Japanese central force unaccountably left the area. Confusion and uncertainty characterized the actions of commanders on both sides during the battle for Leyte Gulf. This epic naval battle marked the end of the Japanese fleet as an active surface force. In spite of faulty coordination between top U.S. commanders, the battle for Leyte Gulf was a resounding U.S. victory. A victory which ensured the success of the Philippine campaign, since no further large-scale naval attacks could be made by the enemy on the Philippine beachheads. The battle for Leyte Gulf was a notable milestone on the road to the final defeat of Japan. During the last days of October and throughout November, the battle for Leyte Island continued. The enemy strengthened his force on Leyte by sending reinforcements from Luzon as soon as Japan's Show Plan No. 1 for the defense of the Philippines was put into effect. Some 40 to 45,000 Japanese troops were moved from Luzon and other islands to Leyte. But these reinforcements were usually dispatched in oddly assorted lots. Thus, the Japanese on Leyte were never able to function as a single coordinated fighting force. And the movement of troops to Leyte was draining the strength of the elite Japanese 14th Area Army, whose men had been prepared to fight a carefully planned defense of Luzon. On Leyte, the soldiers who arrived safely were simply added to units which were fighting a losing action against the American GIs. The fight for Leyte finally resolved itself into a series of small unit actions. The enemy's casualties on Leyte continued to mount. During the battle for Leyte Island, Japanese pilots introduced a new kind of aerial attack. Suicide pilots, or kamikazes, crashed their planes into U.S. ships. A number of American ships of all types were rammed in these desperate attacks. Crews could expect little advance warning. But some of the kamikazes were more successful in their farewell dives. On shore, the battle for Leyte Island continued, with the GIs advancing quickly. By December 1st, there were 7 U.S. divisions fighting on Leyte, 3 of which had joined the fight after the original landings. The key port city of Ormoc fell to the 77th Division on December 11th. By the end of the year, all organized resistance on Leyte had ended, and the island was once more in American possession after 3 years of enemy occupation. Meanwhile, U.S. troops went ashore unopposed on Mindoro on December 15th and quickly established a beachhead as a base for subsequent operations. Then, on January 9th, 1945, 4 U.S. Army divisions invaded Luzon, focal point of the Philippine campaign. The GIs landed at Lingayen Gulf. Early that afternoon, General MacArthur went ashore to inspect the rapidly expanding U.S. beachhead. The general was jubilant. The lack of opposition confirmed his conviction that the enemy would be taken by surprise. He considered the Lingayen operation an unqualified success. The 68,000 GIs who landed on that first day were given a warm welcome by the overjoyed Filipinos, who had been dreaming of this moment for 3 years. The troops were not accustomed to making this kind of an invasion. The landing at Lingayen Gulf had little in common with previous assaults made by the GIs in New Guinea and the Solomons. Filipino guerrillas who had carried on sporadic raids against the enemy during the black years just ended enthusiastically joined forces with the GIs, volunteering to act as scouts. by the Filipinos, the American drive southward toward Manila gathered momentum. The GIs passed numerous dugouts where enemy soldiers met their death along the 117-mile route. The American advance moved swiftly through the remnants of the enemy's elite Luzon force. Heavy U.S. air attacks were made daily on airfields near Manila. With the enemy's airfields under almost constant attack, GIs of the 37th Infantry and 1st Cavalry Division closed in on the capital city from the north. By February 4th, both divisions were moving through the suburbs and were ready for the crucial battle for Manila itself. The drive to capture Manila proper began with heavy fighting. The GIs were well aware that it would be a tough job. The enemy was prepared to defend every building and took a heavy toll of U.S. fighting men. The streets of Manila turned quickly into a battleground. In the bitter fight for the Philippines' capital city, the GIs of the 1st Cavalry Division made their first objective the camp where many Americans were held prisoner. Among them, Army Nurse Lieutenant Eula Fales of Houston, Texas.
It's hard to describe how I felt when the first American soldiers reached us at Santa Tomas. The great surge of joy on being free again is almost too much to bear after 32 months being prisoners. Without any question, it was the happiest moment of our lives. The prospect of actually going home again was a little hard to get used to at first. I think we all felt that we were getting a second chance at life, a chance which some of us didn't expect.
Outside Manila at Cabanatuan prison camp, American fighting men who had fought the desperate defense of Corregidor during the early months of the war were liberated on January 30th, 1945. At Bilibid, another camp in the Manila area, more Americans were freed after 3 years of imprisonment. Some had managed to survive the ordeal. Others had not been so fortunate. One American prisoner had died the day before the camp was liberated. The fight for Manila continued unabated. On February 15th, the struggle shifted to a strange setting for such a grim engagement: Harrison Ballpark. General Mudge himself helped a private who had been wounded remove a casualty to safety. The ballpark was finally taken. By February 23rd, the fight for Manila was centered in the Intramuros, the old walled city. GIs of the 129th and 145th Infantry Regiments swiftly annihilated enemy resistance. For 4 weeks, Manila existed in a state of complete chaos. To the residents of Manila, February 1945 was a month of horror. 16th, an assault by air was made against Corregidor, the historic rock in Manila Bay. More than 2,000 men of the 503rd Parachute Regiment were to make the jump. The C-47s flew over the 1/2 square mile head of Corregidor at low level and prepared to eject their cargo of experienced assault troops over the target area, 2 small patches of clearing. The men jumped from a height of only 400 feet. An 18-mile-an-hour wind complicated the problem of landing precisely on the 2 pinpointed spots. But most of the men made it successfully to the designated areas. The operation went off on schedule, but not exactly smoothly. A few of the men missed the rock entirely. The operation was considered eminently worthwhile since the enemy had not prepared for an attack from the skies. "267 men were injured in the spectacular drop. Once on the rock, the paratroopers went right to work on fulfilling their assignment, to rout the enemy out of his last-ditch defenses on the island where American fighting men had made their unforgettable stand in 1942. To reinforce the air assault, the 3rd Battalion of the 34th Infantry Regiment landed on the south shore of Corregidor. The troops pushed ahead quickly to take Malinta Hill. Opposition on the beach was negligible, since the enemy had been caught completely off guard by the air invasion. In addition, the landing on the south shore of the island also came as a surprise to the enemy, who had expected an assault on the northern beaches. The fight for Corregidor lasted for almost 2 weeks. Soon after the seizure of Corregidor, General MacArthur arrived for the formal ceremony which marked the island's return to U.S. possession. He ordered the assembled troops, hoist the colors, and let no enemy ever haul them down. Corregidor was a notable milestone on the road to Tokyo. 3 days after Corregidor was invaded, Iwo Jima, some 1,600 miles to the north, was assaulted by 3 divisions of United States Marines.
On fire.
In late 1944, the U.S. High Command decided that Iwo Jima must be seized, and preparations were made for the assault against that island fortress. Beginning in October, American B-24s made regular pre-invasion bomb runs to Iwo. The U.S. 7th Air Force bombed Iwo Jima almost daily for 72 days in late 1944 and early 45. At U.S. bases in the Pacific, Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions prepared for the assault. The invasion troops were accompanied on the trip to the objective by great quantities of materiel, the machines of 20th century war. With the assault forces aboard ship, the task force moved northward toward the island target in mid-February. In waters so close to the enemy's homeland, it was no longer possible to capitalize on the element of surprise. The Marines who were to make the assault were briefed on the enemy and his defenses. No punches were pulled. The men were told that Iwo was the closest thing to a fortress in the Pacific Ocean. At least they knew what to expect. There was nothing further the commanders could do to change the complexion of the head-on assault. Before the men stormed ashore to seize the island fortress, a last blessing was given by the troop chaplains. The final divine services on shipboard were attended by many of the assault Marines, who welcomed the opportunity to rededicate their efforts to God. The warships opened up on the island at 6:40 on D-Day morning. An interested observer aboard the flagship was Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who said at that time, "This target, like Tarawa, leaves very little except to take it by force of arms, character, and courage." Mount Suribachi, which dominated the island, was a prime target for Navy gunners. The preliminaries to the actual landing went off smoothly. H-hour had been set at 9 a.m., and everyone was intent on making it on schedule. Trained to razor sharpness, the Marines took to the boats early on D-Day morning. Some 10,000 men of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions left the transports to make the initial assault. On that faintly chilly February morning, the sea was calm. Many of the Marines were veterans of other campaigns. Some had never been in combat before. Men like Private First Class Harold Wergers.
I tried to figure out what time it was in St. Louis, my hometown. This operation had all the earmarks of being a real fight. At a time like this, you felt all keyed up inside, the blood coursing through your veins so fast your fingertips tingled. You wanted to get ashore quick and start getting some of those guys who were firing at our ships and scoring a hit every now and then. It seemed like hours getting to the beach. It began to get rougher, but my outfit, the 1st Battalion, 28th Marine Regiment, made it okay. I never expected it to be this rough. Some companies were cut down to half strength that first morning, half their men knocked out. More men were landed, including the rest of my regiment, the 28th Marines. We had to hang on to that beachhead, whatever happened. What made it even tougher was the slow going in that volcanic sand. It slowed us down, and it slowed the equipment down. The fight for the beachhead at Iwo was a real nightmare. I don't think any of us will ever forget it. That first morning, about a third of the men in our company got hit. But we kept on fighting for that toehold. Iwo didn't get any more comfortable at any time during those first few days. The corpsmen had their hands full. They were busier than any of us. A lot of our equipment got bogged down in the loose sand and was knocked out by the enemy. And an awful lot of Marines got it on the beach at Iwo.
On the evening of D+2, the U.S. ships offshore were attacked in a heavy air raid. The gunners scored hits on some of the Japanese suicide planes. In the furious 3-hour-long battle, the U.S. lost one carrier and had another damaged. 15 of the kamikazes were knocked down. From Mount Suribachi, the Japanese poured their fire on the landing beaches below. No spot on the U.S. beachhead was protected from enemy fire as long as the Japanese held Suribachi. The job of bringing additional troops ashore under that heavy pounding was a delicate operation. And just as important as the added manpower was the materiel, which was so necessary in the drive to reduce the enemy's fortress. It became obvious on the first day that Suribachi would have to be taken as quickly as possible. Elements of the 28th Marine Regiment were assigned the job of seizing Suribachi, including Private First Class Werger's unit.
We gave the Hot Rock everything we had. But it was tough going. They kept pouring it down on top of us. It seemed like weeks just fighting for the land around the base of the rock. Finally, on what they tell me was the 4th day on Iwo, we began to pick our way up the slope. On the way up, we ran into some Japs, but they didn't give us too much trouble. This was no place for anybody with a weak stomach.
The Marines of the 28th Regiment spent 4 days in getting to the crest of the 556-foot-high mountain. Once again, the Marine spirit had been a prime factor in the capture of this difficult objective against great odds. On February 23rd, 1945, the Marines raised the U.S. flag atop Mount Suribachi as a signal to the troops below that the mountain was won. That flag was seen around the world. During those first 5 days on Iwo, the Marine Corps suffered 6,845 casualties. Of that number, 5,284 were wounded, and a great many of those men were saved. Most of the wounded were surgical cases. Some of the casualties were suffering badly from shock. The men who took Suribachi were able to appreciate why it had been so tough. The enemy had been solidly entrenched. The Japanese on Iwo's mountain had fought one of the most determined defenses of the war. But it had proved fruitless. Hundreds of dead Japanese soldiers were strewn about the slopes of Mount Suribachi after the battle. The situation was reversed. The U.S. forces now dominated the southern end of the island. The original U.S. beachhead was littered with wrecked equipment. But though a considerable amount of materiel had been rendered useless to the U.S. fighting men on Iwo, other machines and weapons in impressive quantities had been successfully brought ashore and put to use against the enemy. Ground Forces Commander Marine General Holland Smith was anxious to have the area cleared of enemy mines and rendered safe for the landing of additional reinforcements and supplies for use in the drive north on the island. 3rd Marine Division combat troops, which had been held in reserve, landed on Iwo with 3rd Marine Division headquarters and attached units. The 2 regimental combat teams of the 3rd Marine Division now on the island were to be used in the center of the drive north. The reinforcements, too, were surprised by the difficult footing. In the loose volcanic sand, vehicles designed for use on any terrain bogged down hopelessly. On Iwo, metal mats were essential for the movement of many vehicles inland from the beaches. The invading Marines had not expected to have so much trouble with Iwo's soil, but they overcame the problem in short order nevertheless. Before the concerted attack against the enemy for the northern section of the island, some Marines attended religious services only a short distance from enemy positions to the north. One of the Marines' most pressing supply problems was the lack of water on the island. After the southern end of the island had been secured, the Marines installed distillation units, which converted the seawater and signaled the end of limited water rationing, which had prevailed since the morning of D-Day. With Suribachi and the southern end of Iwo won, the U.S. forces girded themselves for the conquest of the northern section of the island. The 3 Marine divisions which would fight that campaign were well prepared. Some of the men who had battled the enemy on Mount Suribachi took a few moments off to clean up before going back into action. U.S. forces controlled the southern end of the island, but still had to seize the broader northern section. General Holland Smith and his staff were faced with the problem of taking that territory from a well-disciplined enemy force of considerable size. The Marines' campaign against the enemy on the northern part of the island, which had been begun on the second day, picked up momentum after Suribachi had been taken, and all the Marine units on the island could be concentrated on the final sweep to the north. That drive called for the perfect coordination of the troops of the 3 Marine divisions, working smoothly together under difficult conditions. The success of the Marine drive to the northern tip of Iwo depended in large measure on the performance in action of U.S. tanks. Some 150 Shermans were employed on Iwo to pace the advance of Marine ground forces in the drive north. This phase of the battle for Iwo was much tougher than the fight for Suribachi. For a solid week, 4th Division Marines fought for a series of ridges surrounding Hill 382, less formally known as the Meat Grinder. And for a week, they were driven back. Then the drive northward on the right flank continued. Once its rockets were fired, the vulnerable rocket launchers quickly left the area. Casualties grew heavier as the Marines pushed the frantic enemy into a smaller and smaller corner of the island. In some areas, the territory had to be taken ridge by ridge. The drive for the capture of the 3rd Airfield on Iwo was executed by 3rd Division Marines, who led the advance up the island at the point of the wedge-shaped offensive. In crashing through the enemy's strong defensive line, the men of the 3rd Division took quite a beating. The men of the 2 regimental combat teams of the 3rd Marine Division broke the back of the enemy's main stand in the north of Iwo. The enemy force on the island was rapidly being whittled down. But even though the main defense belt had been penetrated, the wary Marines still had some territory to seize from the stubbornly resisting enemy. The U.S. force had suffered the loss of much equipment and thousands of fighting men. But Iwo Jima, only 750 miles from Tokyo, was almost entirely in American possession. No longer would enemy planes take off from Iwo's strips on missions against U.S. forces in the heart of Japan's inner defense zone. The campaign on Iwo Jima had several noteworthy aspects from a medical standpoint. One was the employment of whole blood and plasma on a scale never before attempted, with gratifying results. It had been estimated that casualties would total 31% of the entire force. Actually, casualties amounted to almost 33% of U.S. manpower participating in the operation on the island. The Navy operated an evacuation hospital, which began functioning on the island on the 9th day of the battle. All the necessary facilities were available to Navy doctors and corpsmen, working only a mile or two from the front. With the opening of several evacuation hospitals on Iwo, it was possible for all initial surgery to be performed on the island itself. The most difficult cases were operated on as quickly as possible, often less than an hour after the wound had been sustained, and the lives of thousands of fighting men were saved. Starting on the 13th day of the battle for Iwo, many of the casualties were evacuated by air. At certain times, this method provided the only means of evacuation from the island because of unfavorable sea conditions or lack of facilities afloat. During the last 3 weeks of the battle on Iwo, about 100 casualties a day were put aboard planes and flown off the island. By March 16th, the Marines had won all of Iwo, except for a small area near the northern tip of the island. Japanese who had been taken prisoner were used to appeal to their brothers in arms to surrender. But in most cases, the appeals were not as successful as other methods of persuasion. Some prisoners were taken on Iwo, but they represented only a handful of the 22,000 troops who had fought the carefully executed defense of the island. Only 217 prisoners were taken, 159 of them Japanese. As on other Pacific battlegrounds, the soldiers who surrendered spoke readily about the location of their positions. The Marines were eager to clean out the last enemy pocket. The Marines who were engaged in seizing the last enemy area had been fighting on Iwo for almost 4 weeks. It was slow, exacting work. Finally, by March 25th, the men completed the job. In the battle for the last pocket, some of the enemy soldiers had held out until the very end. In Iwo Jima, the enemy lost one of its most vital defensive bastions. After 36 days of the most bitter fighting American forces had ever known, the U.S. had all of Iwo. For that 8-square-mile heap of volcanic ash jutting out of the Pacific, the U.S. had paid an exorbitant price: the lives of 5,563 Marines and 982 sailors. In addition to the dead, the casualty figure showed some 19,000 men wounded in the battle for Iwo Jima. Tons of shell cases gave evidence of the important role played by artillery in the 5-week-long campaign. U.S. forces in the Pacific had decided that Iwo must be taken at any cost, and they had thrown themselves into the struggle with all the power available. With the job successfully accomplished, the top priority assignment was the extension of one of the airfields so that it could accommodate America's newest heavy bombers. Marine engineering units and Navy construction battalions accomplished their job in miraculously short order. The field's great value to the U.S. lay in its use as an emergency base for crippled B-29s, unable to return all the way to their Marianas bases. More than 850 damaged B-29s landed safely at Iwo during the following 3 months. In addition, Iwo strips provided a perfect base for U.S. fighter planes, now capable of making it to Japan and return. With fighter cover, the raids on Japan were less hazardous. After the victory at Iwo, Okinawa was the next major enemy island on the U.S. schedule. An assault force of soldiers and Marines made the invasion on Easter Sunday, 1945. In early 1945, U.S. forces focused their attention on an imposing objective, Okinawa. President Roosevelt returned from Yalta and reported on the most significant developments of that important conference with Great Britain and Russia.
We haven't won the wars yet, with an S on wars. It's a long, tough road to Tokyo. It's longer to go to Tokyo than it is to Berlin, in every sense of the word. The defeat of Germany will not mean the end of the war against Japan. On the contrary, we must be prepared for a long and costly struggle in the Pacific. But the unconditional surrender of Japan is as essential as the defeat of Germany.
In the far Pacific, 3 divisions of U.S. Marines were engaged in wiping out the enemy on a small strategic volcanic island named Iwo Jima. Japan still managed to supply its troops on the Asiatic mainland, where the Emperor's forces were firmly entrenched. If Okinawa were taken by the U.S., Japan's supply line to those forces would be effectively severed. In March 1945, at Ulithi in the Caroline Group, the U.S. Navy amassed an amphibious force of unprecedented proportions. That force moved north, directed by one of the Navy's top amphibious fleet commanders, Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. Carrier planes of Admiral Spruance's 5th Fleet hit the home islands of Japan and then softened up the target island of Okinawa. Meanwhile, the warships of the mighty 5th Fleet moved toward the objective. And on March 25th, enemy positions on the island came under attack by a score of U.S. warships, which fired salvo after salvo. On March 26th, 77th Division GIs assaulted the Kurama Islands, a valuable subsidiary base of operations. And on April 1st, the key island of Okinawa was invaded. The U.S. 10th Army, which was composed of GIs of the Army's 24th Corps and Marines of the 3rd Amphibious Corps. 16,000 men were in the first wave to land on Japan's doorstep, on the western coast of Okinawa. It seemed hard to believe, but there was no opposition. Most of the veterans in the invasion force, old campaigners who had fought at Saipan, Peleliu, and Leyte, suspected that this was an April Fool's Day trick on the enemy's part. The soldiers and Marines pushed across the island and were followed by thousands more. The men advanced quickly across the neck of the island toward the east coast, against very light resistance. Only scattered enemy troops fired on the invaders. U.S. troops gained ground easily. The American plan was to bisect the island and thus divide the enemy's forces. During those first few days on Okinawa, U.S. soldiers and Marines encountered only feeble resistance. It was difficult for the men to understand. Only 350 miles from Japan and no heavy opposition by the enemy. In the advance across the island's neck, the American fighting men did meet some enemy patrols, but no opposition strong enough to impede the 10th Army's progress. The island was cut in two by April 4th, when U.S. troops reached the East Coast. During the next 3 days, a considerable amount of territory was seized in the northern section. The beachhead was firmly established, and supplies were being brought ashore in impressive quantities. To keep the men of the 10th Army fed and equipped put a heavy burden on the Navy, which employed more than 1,000 ships of all types during the Okinawa campaign. At sea, the men of the vast fleet standing off the island were growing concerned about the enemy's heavy air attacks. Off Okinawa, the Japanese made maximum use of their frenzied kamikaze attack plan. Heavy losses as further waves of suicide planes dove into U.S. ships. Off Okinawa became as violent a battleground as the island itself. At air, the men in the fleet, the skies seemed always full of kamikazes. Between Okinawa and the Japanese home islands, some U.S. ships were hit in enemy bombing attacks. On the U.S. carrier Franklin, casualties were very heavy. In the struggle to save the ship, Chaplain Joseph O'Callaghan of Cambridge, Massachusetts, played a memorable part and was subsequently awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor.
It appeared that most of the crew were dead, and of the living, almost everyone was wounded. The few survivors of Franklin will never forget that cold March morning in the far Pacific. The flight deck littered with dead and dying. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
More than 250 U.S. ships of all types were sunk or damaged by the enemy's air attacks in the Okinawa operation. On April 12, 1945, U.S. fighting forces lost their commander-in-chief. While a sorrowing nation mourned his passing, a new chief executive took the oath of office. President Harry Truman was well aware of his heavy responsibilities as America's war leader. In Washington, the nation's grief was mirrored in the faces of the crowds which lined the route of the procession. halfway around the world on Okinawa, many of the combat troops paused to attend a memorial service not far from the front. President Roosevelt's death at this critical point was a real blow to the servicemen, who had felt a close bond with their late commander-in-chief. Some officers worried about a drop in morale, but most of the men resolved to fight with even greater determination to help achieve the final victory as quickly as possible. On Okinawa, the battle was far from won. Cleaning out the long section of the island north of the beachhead was the job of the 6th Marine Division. They moved quickly against an enemy force which was fighting from ideal natural defensive positions. On Motobu Peninsula, the Marines ran into sudden stiff resistance near Mount Yaitaki. The enemy pocket was wiped out during a 3-day fight by the veterans of Eniwetok and Guam. The men moved forward quickly and cleaned out the peninsula where most of the enemy's northern force on Okinawa was concentrated. In the 13-day campaign on Motobu, 2,014 enemy soldiers met death. The Marines mopped up the rugged northern area of Okinawa against sporadic resistance. All but a handful of the thousands of Japanese were killed by the 6th Marine Division in taking the northern section of the island. On April 20th, the Marines of the 6th Division secured the northern section of Okinawa. In a quick amphibious operation, 77th Division GI seized Ieshima, where the foot soldier's great friend and supporter Ernie Pyle met his death. On southern Okinawa, General Simon Bolivar Buckner, 10th Army commander, ran up against the enemy's main line of defense. Artillery, supported by tanks, went to work on the enemy's defensive line. In early May, the Army's 24th Corps, stalled on the southern front, was reinforced by the Marines of the 3rd Amphibious Corps. The battle-wise enemy commander, General Ushijima, had chosen to make his stand along a line which stretched across the island from Naha to Yonabaru. On May 8th, the 6th Division Marines prepared to attack south along the west coast in the drive to take Naha and pierce the enemy's line. To cut that western anchor of the enemy's defense, the Marines concentrated all their power in the new offensive. The battle remained a stalemate, partly attributable to the heavy rains which turned the countryside into a morass of mud. Most of the heavy equipment became hopelessly bogged down in the mire. The Army 24th Corps, which was trying to mount a crushing offensive against the bulk of the enemy's Okinawa force, found its assignment especially difficult with the beginning of Okinawa's celebrated plum rains, which set in on a daily basis late in May and greatly complicated the operation. The struggle to reduce the enemy's positions in the Naha area continued for several weeks. Dislodging the enemy from his carefully prepared defenses was a demanding assignment and a costly one. The Marines' answer to the enemy's strong, well-integrated defenses was the tank infantry team. In the U.S. attack, some tanks were lost, and the Marines suffered a sizable number of casualties before they were able to move into the capital city. After a bitter campaign, the Marines completed the capture of Naha by May 28th. The city was almost a total wreck. For their successful seizure of this hub of the enemy's defense on Okinawa, 2 regiments of the 6th Marine Division, the 22nd and 29th, were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. The city had felt the full weight of U.S. firepower. The fall of the capital city signaled the beginning of the last major phase of the battle for Okinawa. With Naha in American possession, the offensive picked up speed all along the line. 3 Army and 2 Marine divisions pressed the attack with renewed spirit from one coast of Okinawa to the other, from the Pacific Ocean to the East China Sea. Marines of the 1st Division pierced the enemy's salient at Shuri in the island's rugged interior. The U.S. forces suffered a considerable number of casualties in beating down the enemy's grim defense of southern Okinawa. The news from the European theater gave the men a lift. But on Okinawa, there was still a war to be fought. The seizure of the Yunabaru area by soldiers of the 24th Corps marked the collapse of the enemy's defense line on Okinawa's east coast. Across the island, 6th Division Marines encountered stiff resistance on Oroku Peninsula. Fight for Oroku Peninsula, the enemy suffered some 5,000 casualties. The Marines worked hard to annihilate the enemy's last-ditch defense. With resistance eliminated on Oroku Peninsula, the 6th Marine Division controlled the entire Naha area. For this action, the 4th Marine Regiment was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. In the capture of Oroku Peninsula, the U.S. forces gained control of Naha Airfield, complete with dummy planes, which the enemy used to suggest a strong air base. With the airfield no longer in enemy hands, U.S. forces could finally make use of the port of Naha. By mid-June, U.S. troops had completely broken the enemy's main line of defense on Okinawa. On June 17th, U.S. forces were only a few miles from the southern tip of the island. Once the main defense of Okinawa had been fought, to no avail, the Japanese soldiers began to give themselves up more readily. The combat efficiency of the remaining Japanese units was cut down by the heavy casualties the defenders of Okinawa were sustaining. The advancing American troops also brought a number of civilians to safety. Some of the Okinawans had holed out in any place of refuge available. Some had stayed hidden for weeks. Many had had no food or water for some time. The Okinawans had been led to expect far different treatment than they actually received at the hands of the American troops. As the 83-day battle for Okinawa neared its end, thousands of inhabitants of that hilly island gave themselves up. For the Okinawans, the war was at an end. The natives now saw Japanese claims of victory after victory in their true light. On Okinawa, some 196,000 of the island's population were herded into internment camp areas to keep them out of the path of the final U.S. offensive. Even under these hectic conditions, an attempt was made to keep members of a family from being separated. The prisoner of war camps were crowded with the largest concentration of Japanese troops ever taken prisoner in any campaign during World War II in the Pacific. In the closing days of the battle, the enemy soldiers had finally refused to obey their officers, had surrendered themselves to their conquerors. The code of Bushido, death before surrender, was no longer followed without question by Japanese fighting men. At the southern front, 10th Army Commander General Buckner had final victory in his grasp when his life was cut short by an enemy shell. Meanwhile, the drive for the last piece of enemy territory on Okinawa was underway. Weapon, the recoilless rifle, was used for the first time in combat during the campaign's final days. On June 22nd, 1945, the last enemy unit was overwhelmed. American fighting men controlled Okinawa to the extreme southern tip. The enemy had lost an invaluable base only 350 miles from Japan proper. And the United spotting and picking up airmen and sailors whose vessels had been destroyed by the enemy. Some 500 U.S. servicemen were rescued at sea by U.S. subs in the Pacific during the war against Japan. With the seizure of Iwo Jima in February and March 1945, U.S. fighter planes had a base from which they could easily fly to Japan and return. At the Marianas B-29 bases, preparations were made for heavier attacks against the enemy's home islands, now that the big bombers would have fighter cover over the target area. The operation of the bases from which the raids against Japan were launched became a larger and more complex problem during the early months of 1945. The mapping out of routes to specific targets in Japan for some 1,000 B-29s was only one of the exacting jobs which added to the traffic problem for the operations center of the 21st Bomber Command. This office was a highly geared nerve center in the preparation of the raids over Japan. Shortly before takeoff time, the crews had their targets spotted for them on the radar scope.
Here's how the scope should look when you've located the target and have gain and tilt properly adjusted. Here's your target today. The arsenal is located to the left side of the town. However, since the 3 degrees beam width tends to spread a town out along an axis perpendicular to the airplane, do not aim at the edge of the town, but a little inside the left edge. You can see then that it's important that you hit your initial point on the money and make an accurate turn to the target heading. Otherwise, you may not be able to find your target.
Final preparations for the flight were made in an atmosphere which was always charged with excitement. For the crew members, no mission over the heart of the enemy's homeland ever became routine. The start of another flight on the most dangerous run in the Pacific Theater was always a dramatic moment. 300 super forts were ready for the takeoff. The giant planes hurtled down the runway right on schedule. Some 1,500 miles from this island base lay the heart of Japan, the objective of the 300 B-29s in this early April raid. Over Iwo Jima, halfway to the target, the superforts were joined by Mustangs of the 7th Fighter Command, based on that island, recently seized by U.S. Marines. The P-51s embarked eagerly on their first mission to Japan. With fighter support, the big bombers were much better able to cope with enemy attacks in the skies over Japan. The U.S. pilot got a close look at his recent adversary. The B-29s assigned to hit the Tokyo area usually checked their position by sighting in on Mount Fuji before moving in on the target.
Radar operator, this is Bombardier. Over.
Go ahead, Bombardier.
The site's set up. We're ready to bomb.
Roger, out. Pilot, correct 8 degrees right.
Roger.
Bombardier, open bomb bay doors after turn.
Roger.
Get ready on 70 degrees.
Ready on 70 degrees.
Ready on 60 degrees. Mark.
Bombs away.
This was the moment when the long flight paid off. The super forts dropped their bombs right on the target. Beginning in March, B-29s from the Marianas began dropping incendiaries on Japan at night. But these night attacks were discontinued, since the results were not particularly impressive from the standpoint of damage done to military targets. The superforts intensified their daylight attacks on industrial and military objectives in Japan during the early spring months of 1945. Tokyo came in for the largest share of attention from the B-29s of the 21st Bomber Command of the 20th Air Force. These mass attacks had a shattering effect on Japan's capital city. The city was bombed into a great mass of rubble. Most of Tokyo's fragile buildings had simply disappeared under the heavy pounding from the skies. A few, like the Diet Building, where the legislature met, had survived. Tokyo's inhabitants were thoroughly broken in spirit. In March, the B-29s had an emergency base on Iwo Jima, located midway between Japan and the Marianas Fields. Crippled superforts, unable to make it all the way back to their home bases after being hit over Japan, came into Iwo. Some 2,000 B-29s landed at Iwo, some not too successfully. Thousands of airmen who would otherwise have perished were saved at Iwo. The U.S. Third Fleet also closed in on Japan to administer a softening up of the home islands in preparation for invasions by U.S. amphibious forces. Admiral Bull Halsey, the Third Fleet's commander, moved boldly into the waters off the Japanese coast. On July 17, 1945, U.S. and British warships fired some 2,000 tons of shells into the coastal area northeast of Tokyo. The fleet units encountered no opposition during this daring attack on the enemy's homeland. Japan was ripe for invasion. In the United States, before the war, Albert Einstein... The first atomic bomb explosion was an impressive success. In the Marianas, at 20th Air Force Headquarters, General Curtis LeMay and his staff worked at feverish speed on the planning for the use of the new top-secret weapon against the enemy. If the atom bomb could be safely transported by air to a point over Japan, its use could well have such a devastating effect that the war might be materially shortened. The target was finally selected. The Japanese city of Hiroshima had escaped damage in U.S. bombing raids on the home islands. On that sunny August morning, Hiroshima had no premonition of its fate. On Tinian Island in the Marianas, a B-29 named the Enola Gay prepared to make the first atomic bomb run. Over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the course of world history took a new turn. The new weapon blasted the enemy completely out of the war. Japan no longer had the will to fight. Hiroshima lay in ruins. Within a few seconds, the sizable city had been demolished by the atomic blast. On August 19th, 4 days after the enemy surrendered, a Japanese plane arrived at Ieshima, the tiny island off Okinawa. This was the first meeting between American commanders and Japanese military men since the surrender. The Japanese negotiators stopped off at Ieshima to be taken by U.S. transportation to Manila to discuss the terms of the surrender. In late August, preparations were made for the formal surrender ceremony. An excited Japanese harbor pilot was transferred to the Missouri from a ship alongside. On the Missouri, U.S. naval officers carefully studied the charts of Tokyo Bay, which the Japanese pilot had brought aboard. Every precaution was taken to be sure that the Big Mo would be guided safely through the channels to its berth in Tokyo Bay. Meanwhile, at Yokosuka Naval Base, U.S. fighting men went ashore to occupy the conquered country.
We have another bulletin here. Japan surrenders. Japan surrenders. Now repeating the entire bulletin, the Japanese government...
On a day most Americans will never forget, August 15th, 1945, the Third Fleet was in waters near Japan. Its commander, Admiral Bull Halsey, was impatiently waiting for the news which all the world was anxious to hear.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
Finally, the all-important message came through by wireless. The enemy had surrendered. The war was over. Every man in the fleet, from admiral to able-bodied seaman, felt an immense surge of relief. After nearly 4 years, U.S. fighting forces had won the victory. On August 30th, American troops of the 6th Marine Division landed on Japanese soil at Yokosuka Naval Base, south of Tokyo. U.S. officers quickly assumed control of the installation and issued orders on procedure to the Japanese officers who had been in charge. With U.S. command firmly established, the Stars and Stripes was raised over the Japanese homeland. Later that same day, a silver C-54 bearing an important passenger came into Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. The commander of U.S. forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater, General Douglas MacArthur, had completed the last leg of the long drive to the Japanese homeland. The general was greeted by one of his most faithful field officers, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, 8th Army Commander. General MacArthur was ready and eager to take over control of the conquered country. On the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, a Japanese delegation arrived early on the morning of September 2nd, 1945, to make the unconditional surrender official. The Japanese contingent faced an impressive array of Allied officers. The ceremonies were directed by the new Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Japan, General MacArthur, who took a firm attitude toward the conquered people.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
Representing the Emperor at the proceedings which concluded the costliest war in world history was Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, who formally surrendered for his country, thus committing Japan to accept the Potsdam Declaration, calling for the complete disarmament and surrender of all military forces. A few hundred U.S. servicemen witnessed the climax of 4 years of war in the Pacific. That war ended officially at 8 minutes past 9 a.m. on September 2nd, 1945.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed.